Listen today!
The dog hadn't let anyone touch him in 11 months. Not the handlers, not the veterinarians who came with gloves and patience, and eventually left with neither. Not the senior sergeant who had worked military K-9 units for 19 years and said quietly to no one in particular that he had never seen an animal that far gone and still breathing. 11 months of silence from a dog who used to retrieve on the first command. 11 months of shadows and low growling and a chain-link fence that everyone at Fort Benning had learned without being told to walk wide around. They called him Ranger. And on a Tuesday night in October, when the Georgia air had finally started to cool and the floodlights over the K-9 compound buzzed with their usual indifference, 3 men dragged a young woman across the gravel yard toward his pen. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. And that more than anything that followed was what nobody at that base ever forgot. 6 weeks earlier, the post was ordinary. Fort Benning stretched out the way military installations always do, flat and purposeful, and slightly too large for the number of people who actually belong there. Buildings the color of old concrete. Roads that go exactly where they need to and nowhere else. A place designed to produce something specific in the people who pass through it, and largely indifferent to who those people were before they arrived. The morning processing line moved the way it always does. Forms, photographs, a sergeant behind a folding table who had answered the same questions so many times that he no longer fully heard them being asked. New arrivals shuffled through in small groups, duffel bags over shoulders, eyes doing the quiet work of taking inventory. Kate Mercer stood in line with the others. She was 26 years old, average height, with the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistake for shyness and sometimes mistake for nothing at all. Her hair was pulled back without care for appearance. Her uniform was clean, but not pressed. There was nothing about her that announced itself. That was entirely intentional. She had chosen this particular kind of invisibility, the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel with precision, with full knowledge of what it was for, and with an understanding that the tool only works if you don't draw attention to it. When the sergeant handed her the base orientation packet, she thanked him in the way that people thank someone when they are already thinking about the next thing. She found a bench near the far wall, sat down and opened the packet to the base map. She marked the mess hall, she marked the barracks, she marked the administrative building and the motor pool in the medical station. And then before she marked anything else, she found the K-9 compound. She placed her finger on it for just a moment, not long enough for anyone watching to notice, not short enough to be accidental. Then she folded the map along its original crease and put it in her left breast pocket. She had known Ranger was here for 6 weeks before she arrived. She had not known what condition he was in. Those were 2 different kinds of knowledge, and the distance between them was the thing that had kept her awake on the long drive down from Washington. The photograph was still on the wall of the Fort Benning Veterinary Station when Kate walked past it later that first morning. She wasn't supposed to be in that part of the compound. She went anyway, moving with the slightly lost expression of someone who had taken a wrong turn, which is one of the oldest and most reliable methods of going exactly where you intend to go. The photo was black and white, printed on regular paper, and taped up with the casual permanence that develops when something has been on a wall long enough that nobody remembers putting it there. A young German shepherd, ears forward, posture perfect, sitting beside a man in his late 50s who was grinning the way people grin when they don't know how to stop. Beneath the photo, written in ballpoint pen on a strip of masking tape, best working dog, class of 21. Handler Sergeant R. Beaumont, retired Ranger, had been the best working dog in his training class. The most responsive, the most reliable, the most capable of the quiet, sustained focus that separates a good military K-9 from an exceptional one. By every metric the military uses to evaluate such things, he had been exactly what he was supposed to be. That was 20 months ago. Sergeant Beaumont had retired with a bad hip and a good record. Ranger had been transferred to Fort Benning, assigned to a new handler, and somewhere in the 13 months that followed, something had broken. Kate looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the barracks, and she did not let her face show what she was thinking, because showing what you're thinking is the luxury of people who are not doing what she was doing. Brad Calloway's room was at the end of the barracks hallway, and it told you most of what you needed to know about him if you knew how to read it. Kate did not go into his room. She had read the file. But she had also walked past the open doorway during the first afternoon, and in the 3 seconds that the doorway gave her, she saw the things that files don't capture. The commendation certificate on the wall, centered, framed with care. A photograph of a forward operating base in Afghanistan that she recognized by the quality of the light and the color of the mountains behind it. And on the desk, not in a drawer, not filed away, a folded piece of paper sitting on the surface where a person puts things they look at often. She had seen enough promotion rejection notices in her career to recognize the shape of one from across a room. Brad Calloway was 28 years old and had been at Fort Benning for 4 years. He had served 2 deployments. He had, according to sources Kate had developed before she arrived, saved the lives of 3 men during a mission in Kandahar province in 2019, in circumstances classified almost immediately afterward. The official record of that day contained a great deal of careful language and very little truth. He had been passed over for promotion twice. The first time he had accepted it the way soldiers are trained to accept things, with the external appearance of equanimity and the internal reality of whatever they actually feel. The second time something had shifted, not broken, shifted, the way a foundation shifts before anyone sees the crack in the wall. He was not the kind of man who was born to do what he was doing to people here. Kate understood that, and understanding it did not make her sympathetic, but it made her precise. Precision was what this required. She had learned that the hard way. She had learned most things the hard way. 14 months before she drove to Georgia, Kate Mercer had been assigned to investigate allegations of misconduct at a training facility outside of Tacoma, Washington. The investigation had taken 11 weeks. She had been thorough. She had been methodical. She had followed the evidence with the single-minded attention that her supervisors had always called her greatest professional asset. She had been wrong. Not about the misconduct. The misconduct was real. Not about the facility, but about the central figure, the man whose name appeared most frequently in the documentation, whose record had the most anomalies, whose pattern of behavior fit the profile most precisely. She had been wrong in a way that could not be walked back. His name was Corporal Daniel Ash. He was 23 years old. He had nothing to do with what had happened at that facility. He had been in the wrong place with the wrong name and the wrong report, and by the time Kate understood this, the formal inquiry had already begun, and institutional machinery, once started, does not stop easily. Daniel Ash lost his position. He spent 7 months fighting a process that should never have touched him. He won eventually in the way people win, when the system finally admits a mistake quietly without fanfare, with a letter of apology carefully worded to avoid saying sorry. Kate had submitted her resignation the same week. Her supervisor had refused it. Gerald Park had been in the Inspector General's office for 22 years and had the specific manner of someone who reserves judgment until he has seen a great deal more. He told her with the directness of a man who had known her for 6 years that resigning was the coward's response to a mistake, and that the correct response was to stay and be better, and that the world had enough people who walked away from their failures and not enough people who stood inside them and learned. She had accepted a voluntary demotion instead. She had asked to be removed from active investigative work. She had spent 14 months reviewing other people's cases, writing summary reports, attending meetings that could have been emails. And then 3 weeks before she drove south, Gerald Park had called her into his office, set a thin folder on the desk between them, and said, "Fort Benning, I think you're ready. I think this one needs you specifically." She had picked up the folder. She had read the first page. She had understood immediately why he said that last part. She had not told him about Ranger. That felt important to keep separate. The investigation was the investigation. Ranger was something older and more personal, filed in a part of her that she did not open at work. She had told herself she could keep those two things separate for as long as she needed to. She was less certain of that now, standing in the veterinary station corridor, looking at a photograph of a dog she had spent 6 months building something with, understanding for the first time the full distance between knowing he was here and knowing what had been done to him. Private Marcus Webb had arrived at Fort Benning 3 weeks before Kate did, and he had spent those 3 weeks doing what cautious people do in dangerous environments, watching mapping and saying very little. He was 24 years old, from rural Pennsylvania, with an economy of movement that Kate recognized on the first day as belonging to someone who has learned that showing too much of yourself in the wrong environment is a specific kind of risk. He kept his opinions to himself. He listened more than he spoke. He had been assigned to the same barracks corridor as Kate, and within 48 hours he had mapped the social architecture of the unit with the thoroughness of a man who understood that this kind of mapping kept you safe. He was not wrong. Kate noticed him noticing things. She filed this in the same careful way she filed everything as information that would either matter or wouldn't. 3 weeks into her time at the base, he fell into step beside her on the path between the mess hall and the barracks. He said without preamble, without looking at her, "Lackland, summer of 2022. You were running the advanced handler certification track." She kept walking. She kept her face neutral. I was there for the first 2 weeks before my transfer came through, he continued. I saw you work with the shepherd they couldn't place, the one that wouldn't respond to anyone. And still she said nothing. I heard he got sent here, Marcus said, to Benning. He stopped walking. She stopped too because stopping was the correct response, the one that gathered more information than continuing. She looked at him directly for the first time. Does that mean help is coming? He said. The question was simple. The weight behind it was not. She could hear in it the exhaustion of someone who had been waiting for something that kept not arriving, the exhaustion of doing the correct thing and discovering that doing the correct thing alone is not sufficient. She said, walk away, Private, right now. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded once and turned and walked in the other direction. She watched him go. She had read his file before she drove to Georgia. Marcus Webb had submitted 3 separate misconduct complaints in the 3 months before her arrival. The first had gone to the company level and gone quiet. The second had gone to the battalion review office and gone quieter. The third he had sent directly to the Inspector General's office in Washington through an emergency submission channel that most junior enlisted service members didn't know existed. Gerald Park had received it on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, he had called Kate into his office. She had not told Marcus any of this. She had not told anyone. The investigation required that she not tell anyone which was the part of this work that she had made peace with years ago, and that still on certain nights felt like a small and necessary betrayal of the people she was trying to help. Brad Calloway noticed Kate in the first week. She understood the mechanism. In every closed hierarchical environment, there is a person whose role is to identify and test the new arrivals, not in any official sense, but in the older instinctive sense, the one that predates military structure by about 40,000 years. Brad Calloway was that person at Fort Benning. He had made a system of it, a quiet, self-sustaining system that operated in the spaces between official oversight in the hours after formation and before lights out in the back corners of the mess hall and the far end of the motor pool parking lot. He looked at new arrivals the way some people look at maps, not to admire them, but to find the quickest route through. He looked at Kate and saw someone quiet, someone who didn't push back. Someone who carried herself with the reserve of a person who had decided for reasons of her own to make herself small. He was not entirely wrong about what he saw. He was catastrophically wrong about what it meant. It started with words the way it always does. A comment in the mess hall line about the way she was standing. A remark during formation that landed in the ambiguous territory between observation and insult. Nothing that could be formally reported. Nothing that left a mark you could photograph. Denny Krause and Garrett Finch followed his lead. Krause was 26 with the nervous energy of someone who laughs too quickly at other people's jokes. Finch was quieter, 25, with the look of a man who knew on some level that he had attached himself to something that would eventually cost him and who had not yet decided if the cost was worth it. Kate absorbed all of it. She did not react, and not reacting in the vocabulary of men like Brad Calloway reads as an invitation to continue. She understood this. She accepted it as the necessary cost of what she was doing, gathering evidence slowly, carefully, without triggering the defensive instincts that cause systems like his to close down and go quiet. She had made this calculation before. She had been right about it before. She told herself in the quiet of the barracks after lights out that she was being disciplined, that this was the job, that the difference between her and the person she had been 14 months ago was that she now understood the price of moving too fast. She believed this most nights. 6 weeks in on a Tuesday in October, Brad Calloway came to find her after evening formation. He had Krause and Finch with him, and they had the particular loose quality of men who have decided that tonight is the night something happens, who have been moving toward this moment all week without formally acknowledging it to themselves or each other. The yard was mostly empty. The floodlights had come on, with the dusk casting everything in flat, shadowless light that makes a place feel both exposed and strangely unreal. The air smelled of Georgia autumn pine resin and cooling asphalt, and somewhere faintly something else. Kate caught the smell before she registered what it was. Wet fur, old meat, the iron of an animal that has been living in distress for a long time. The K9 compound was 200 yards to the northeast. The smell should not have been detectable from this distance. The fact that it was told her something about the wind and something about the compound and something about the animal inside it that sent a cold, quiet thing moving through the center of her chest. Brad stopped in front of her. Krause moved to her left. Finch circled to her right with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed this. Carter, Brad said. He used the wrong name. He had been doing it since the first week, a small thing deliberate, designed to communicate that she did not yet merit the accuracy of her own name. Time to find out what you're made of. She said nothing. There's a tradition here, he said. Every new arrival, it's just how it goes. The word tradition used this way meant, I have done this before and nothing happened. It meant the system has absorbed this. It meant you are not the first and you will not be the last. She knew about the tradition. It was in Marcus Webb's third complaint, documented with dates and names in the level of specificity that comes from a man who understood that vague allegations go nowhere and had made himself document everything precisely. Krause took her left arm and Finch took her right, and Brad produced a length of paracord cut to exactly the right length for what it was going to be used for. He bound her wrists behind her back with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before, and he had at least twice by Kate's count, based on the reports that had not been processed and the quiet departures that had followed. Not tight enough to cut circulation, tight enough to make the point. They walked her across the yard toward the K9 compound, and as they walked, the smell grew stronger. Kate's mind was moving the way it moved when she was doing the work fast and quiet and in multiple directions simultaneously. But underneath the professional assessment, something else was happening, because she knew that smell. Not the compound smell, not the general smell of working dogs housed in institutional conditions. The specific smell, the particular animal underneath it. She had spent 6 months close enough to notice, and the body remembers what the mind sometimes works to contain. The compound gate came into view. The metal bars were scarred in the way that bars get scarred when something very strong and very distressed has been in contact with them for a long time. The chain link was bent at the lower left corner. The ground inside was bare dirt worked over and over by pacing. From somewhere in the shadows at the back of the pen, a sound rose. Low, sustained, resonant, less like a growl than like a warning, delivered in a frequency below language. Brad smiled. They say he hasn't let anyone near him in almost a year, he said. They say he doesn't hesitate. Krause opened the gate. Finch released her arm. They pushed her through. The metal closed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The growl grew. Kate stood in the bare dirt and let her eyes adjust and let her breathing slow and let the part of her that was afraid exist alongside the part of her that was already working, already thinking, already moving through the problem. From the darkness at the back of the pen, the shape resolved. A German shepherd, massive, the kind of muscle and bone that comes from exceptional genetics and serious training. Moving with a liquid quality that did not look like aggression until it did. The scars on the muzzle caught the floodlight. The eyes caught it, too burning with the flat total focus of an animal that has been living in high alert for so long that high alert has become home. Kate did not step back. She took one breath, slow and deliberate. She tilted her head at a precise angle and lowered her center of gravity in the way that says, in a language older than words, I am not a threat. I know what this is. I know who you are. And then pitched for the distance between them, and nothing farther she spoke. Not English. A sequence of sounds built over 6 months at a training facility outside San Antonio. Not a foreign language, not a code, but something more specific than either. A private vocabulary constructed between two individuals through repetition and trust in the daily work of showing up and being consistent. The dog's ears moved, just slightly, just enough. Behind the fence, the laughter faltered. The shape in the darkness stopped moving forward. Kate spoke the next word, and the dog that had not let anyone touch him in 11 months, the dog that 4 handlers couldn't approach, that the veterinarians had given up on that, Brad Calloway had turned into a weapon, took one small step backward. Not in fear, in something that looked at this distance, in this light, like recognition. Kate said his name, not as a command, not as a label, as a simple acknowledgement of a specific individual who deserved to be addressed as such. She said Ranger. And the growl stopped. The growl stopped completely. Not the way sound fades when its source moves away. It stopped the way a held breath stops all at once, leaving behind a silence that had weight and texture and a quality that nobody standing outside that fence had any framework to understand. Ranger stood in the center of the pen. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He stood with his massive frame caught between two competing sets of information. Everything his body had learned in 11 months of isolation and deliberate cruelty, and something older laid down before the cruelty, before the abandonment, before the long, lightless months in a compound that smelled of fear and an absence of kindness. He stood there and he processed. Kate stood 12 feet away and she let him. This was the part that people who had not done this work never understood, that the most important thing you could do in this moment was nothing. Not nothing in the passive sense, but nothing as its own deliberate form of communication. Stillness that said, I am not leaving. I am not advancing. I am here, and I will wait because you are worth waiting for. She had learned this at a training facility outside San Antonio from a handler named Sergeant Beaumont, who had 30 years of K-9 work behind him and a patience that seemed geological in its depth. He had told her on the first day that the single most important skill in this work was the ability to mean what you say to an animal, because animals cannot be lied to about intent, only about words, and they don't care about words. It had taken 6 months to understand what that meant in practice. 47 commands in a language built for one dog specifically, hand signals readable at 300 yards. And on a fourth morning that she still remembered with a precision that surprised her ranger, walking to within 6 feet of her and stopping, which was the moment she understood that patience practiced long enough becomes its own argument. She used that argument now. Ranger's nose worked the air with serious intensity. He was reading a document. He was verifying an identification against a stored record, checking what his instincts were telling him against what the months of cruelty had trained him to expect. It was, she knew, a genuine question he was asking himself, not a rhetorical one. The answer that came back was apparently convincing, because the hackles slowly began to settle. Outside the compound, Brad Calloway had stopped talking. Kraus had stopped laughing. Finch had taken a small step back from the fence, not in a way he would have admitted to, but enough. The silence from inside the pen was the wrong kind of silence. Not the silence of a problem solving itself in the expected direction. The silence of a situation moving somewhere that hadn't been planned for. Brad said to no one in particular, "That's not possible." The words came out flat and factual, stripped of their usual authority. He was not making a social observation. He was reporting something he was genuinely having difficulty integrating. Inside the pen, Kate took one slow step forward. Ranger did not move. She took another. He watched her with an attention that had completely changed quality. Not the locked focus of an animal preparing to act, but the focused attention of recognition. Of being in the presence of something that registers as important in a way that bypasses the learned responses of the past 11 months and reaches something older and deeper. Kate stopped when she was close enough. She lowered herself to one knee. This was the calculated exposure that looked to anyone watching like vulnerability, and it was and it wasn't. It was a gesture in a language she and Ranger had developed together. One that meant, I am choosing to put myself below your eye level because I am not here to be above you. Ranger approached. He moved with a deliberateness entirely different from his earlier posture. He moved like an animal for whom getting this wrong is not something he is willing to risk. He stopped in front of her. His nose found her face and he breathed her in fully, completely, with the thoroughness of something large that is choosing to be careful. Kate remained still. She let him take whatever he needed. She breathed slowly at the rate she knew from 6 months of working with him that he could read. And then he pressed his forehead against her chest. Not hard, not the aggressive lean of an animal asserting itself. Gently, with the gentleness of something strong that is choosing to be careful. Asking in the only way available to him to be held. Kate closed her eyes. She leaned forward into the contact and let it be what it was. Behind the fence, someone crouched by the register said something barely above a whisper that had no real words in it. Just the sound of a man whose working model of a situation has failed him completely. She wasn't listening. She was listening to Ranger's breathing, which had slowed to match hers. Then she opened her eyes. And she really looked at him in the way she had not yet allowed herself to look, because she had needed her assessment to stay professional, needed to be the investigator first, and the person who had built something with this animal somewhere secondary. What she saw made something cold move through her. The ribs were visible through the short coat. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself from a distance, but in the way of sustained deprivation. The gradual erasure of the reserves a healthy animal carries, worn away over months by insufficient food and insufficient care. His coat had the dull, slightly brittle quality of a dog whose nutritional needs are not being met. His eyes, which she remembered as carrying the brightness of an exceptionally alert animal, were still sharp, but the brightness had a different quality now. The brightness of vigilance that never gets to rest. She looked at his right shoulder and found what she had been afraid of finding, a scar 3 inches long, improperly healed. The kind of wound that would have been minor if treated promptly and had become something more significant because it had not been treated at all. The surrounding muscle had compensated, and she could see in the slight irregularity of his gait the long-term cost of that compensation. This had been done over time. This was not an injury or an accident. This was the cumulative result of deliberate neglect maintained across months with the consistency that requires intention. She thought of the two reports in Marcus Webb's file, the two previous arrivals who had been brought to this compound at night and shoved through this gate. One had been transferred out within the week requesting reassignment for undisclosed reasons. The other had reported an unspecified training injury and been hospitalized for 4 days. Ranger had been the mechanism both times. He had been turned into a weapon by people who understood that a traumatized animal in an enclosed space is a reliable source of terror and who had no language for the difference between using a tool and destroying one. Kate said very quietly, barely above a breath, "I should have come sooner." She didn't say it to anyone outside the fence. She didn't say it for the benefit of whatever scene was developing beyond the chain link. She said it to the dog whose forehead was still resting against her sternum, whose breathing had slowed to a rate it almost certainly hadn't reached in months. A real apology, without qualifications, without the defensive machinery that apologies sometimes carry when they're built for an audience. She had known Ranger was here for weeks before she arrived. She had spent those weeks telling herself that this knowledge was professional in nature, that it had informed her decision to take this assignment, that it was one data point among many. She understood now that she had been constructing a story about her own motivations that was tidier than the truth. The truth was simpler and harder. She had come because she could not come. And she had taken too long to get here. And that time had cost this animal, and the bite was visible in 11 months of a shoulder that hadn't been treated and ribs that showed through a short coat. "I should have come sooner," she said again. Ranger made a sound that was nothing like the sound he had been making before. Low soft, the register of an animal whose guard has, for the first time in a very long time, been put down. The silence outside the fence had a different texture now. The silence of men who are watching something they cannot categorize, who are trying to find a framework for what they're seeing and discovering that none of their available frameworks fit. Brad Calloway's face, which had maintained its configuration of careless authority through everything up to this point, had changed. Not into guilt, not into fear exactly, but into the expression of a man who has been shown, without being told, that his understanding of a situation was badly incomplete. Farther back near the corner of the mess hall where the floodlight didn't fully reach, Marcus Webb stood in the shadows. His hands were steady. His phone was recording. He had been there since before they left the barracks. He had followed at a distance that gave him angle without proximity, and he had documented everything. The binding of her wrist, the walk across the yard, the gate closing, the silence that followed. Kate stood. She moved carefully because her hands were still bound, and because Ranger was close and she did not want any sudden movement to undo the work of the past 10 minutes. She straightened slowly, and Ranger rose with her, and when she was fully upright, he moved to her left side and stood there, not commanded, not signaled, simply defaulting to the position they had spent 6 months establishing as correct. Left side shoulder to knee, the working position, as if 11 months had been a parenthesis, as if the document was simply continuing from where it had been interrupted. She turned to face the fence. Brad was standing very still. Krause had his hands in his pockets, the stance of a man who needs to do something with them and has nothing to do. Finch was a step behind the other two, and his expression had settled into something that looked like the face of a person who has been waiting for someone to show him the exit and has just been shown it. Kate walked to the gate. She stopped directly behind it, Ranger at her left, and looked through the bars at the 3 men on the other side. She said clearly and without elevation, "Open the gate, the well." The 3 of them exchanged the kind of look that is a conversation conducted entirely in hesitation and calculation. 3 men trying to determine simultaneously whether the situation could still be recovered. Brad said, "You think this changes anything, Carter?" He still used the wrong name, the reflex of a man trying to reestablish a frame that no longer fits the facts. "Open the gate," she said again. Ranger shifted his weight. He didn't growl. He didn't advance. He simply moved, and the movement alone, the controlled repositioning of 115 pounds of trained animal, communicated everything that needed to be communicated about what happened next if the gate remained closed. Brad held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded at Krause. Krause opened the gate. Kate walked through. Her hands were still bound behind her back. She did not ask them to untie her. She walked out and stopped 4 feet in front of Brad Calloway, and Ranger stopped beside her, and the configuration looked nothing like it had looked 60 minutes ago when they had walked in the other direction. Her hands were trembling. Not visibly, not in a way anyone at this distance could have detected with certainty, but she could feel it. The fine, sustained tremor of adrenaline being held in check by discipline, the body insisting on registering what the mind has instructed it to set aside. She was afraid. She had been afraid since the moment they put their hands on her in the yard, and she had done what her training required, which was to function despite it. But function and feeling are not the same thing, and her hands behind her back where nobody could see them were telling the truth that her face was not. She thought of Tacoma, of the file on Corporal Daniel Ash, of the 7 months he spent fighting a process that should never have touched him, of the way being certain and being right are not always the same thing, and of how you only find out which one you were after the consequences have already landed. She didn't know yet whether she had made any mistakes tonight. She would find out in the same way she always found out, by following the evidence, staying inside the process, trusting that the methodology was sound even when the outcome was uncertain. This was what it meant to be the kind of person who had made a serious professional error and had not walked away from it. You carried the error with you, not as shame as calibration. As the instrument that corrects for the last mistake, which means the last mistake, is always present in how you do the work. She didn't know if that made her better at this. She suspected it made her more accurate, and she was not sure that accuracy and better were the same thing. Brad said, "This is between us, inside the unit. That's how it works here." The words of someone who has relied on a system of silence and is discovering that the system has a boundary he didn't know about. Kate said no. She heard from the far corner of the yard footsteps moving deliberately, not trying to be quiet, making the decision not to be quiet, the footsteps of someone who has decided the moment for concealment is over. Marcus Webb walked into the floodlight. He held up his phone, not aggressively, not as a weapon. The way a person holds up documentation straightforwardly, because it exists and its existence is now relevant to what is happening. "I have all of it," Marcus said, "from the barracks to the gate to right now." Brad looked at Marcus. His face went through several things in rapid succession. Disbelief, calculation, the anger of a man who has built his sense of safety on the assumption that no one is watching, encountering the fact that someone was. He moved toward Marcus with the speed of a man who has made a decision before he finished thinking it. Ranger made one sound, a single syllable, low from the chest. Not the sound of an animal reacting. The sound of an animal communicating a boundary it will not explain further. Brad stopped. He stopped completely immediately without the gradual deceleration of someone choosing to stop, with the completeness of someone who has been given information in a language he cannot argue with. Kraus and Finch had not moved at all. From other buildings, from other corners of the yard, faces were appearing. The earlier commotion, the movement of 3 men and a woman across the yard, the compound lights, the sounds that didn't fit the ordinary rhythms of a Tuesday night, had done what commotion always does in an enclosed community. It had drawn people. Not many. Enough. Kate turned back to Brad and spoke quietly enough that the men around him had to lean slightly in to hear. "His name is Ranger," she said. "He was the top dog in his certification class. He was transferred here 20 months ago. For the last 13 months, he has been deliberately deprived of adequate food, denied medical treatment for a documented shoulder injury, and used as an instrument of intimidation against new arrivals who had done nothing to deserve it." She paused. "This is not the first time. There were people before me. They left quietly because they were given the choice between leaving quietly and whatever came next, and they made the reasonable decision that survival requires compromise. I don't blame them." She looked at Brad directly. "I am not them." From the far edge of the yard where the floodlight thinned and the Georgia night began, a figure stepped forward. Colonel Nancy Doyle was 61 years old, had commanded at Fort Benning for 2 years, and walked with the unhurried precision of someone who has been in military service long enough to know that urgency and speed are not the same thing. She had a jacket over her uniform, which meant she had not come from her office. She had not come because of an alarm. There had been no alarm. She walked into the lit yard and stopped at the edge of the group and looked at the scene in front of her. Brad and Kraus and Finch and Kate, with her wrists still bound, and Ranger at her left side, and Marcus Webb with his phone, and the small cluster of observers at the edges with the expression of a person who is seeing what they expected to see. Not what they hoped to see, not what they feared, what they expected. Kate looked at the colonel. Doyle held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus and at the phone in his hand, and she made the small nod of someone acknowledging a variable that had been accounted for. She said without the performance of surprise, "Private Webb, I'll need that footage secured and transferred to my office within the hour." Marcus said, "Yes, ma'am." Doyle looked at Brad with the quality of someone who has a great deal to say and is choosing deliberately to say very little of it right now. She said, "Corporal Calloway." "Corporal Kraus, Private Finch, you'll come with me." Brad said, "Colonel, this isn't—" Doyle said, That's the last thing you'll say to me tonight that isn't in response to a direct question. Do you understand? The yard went quiet in the way that yards go quiet when someone with actual authority has spoken. Doyle turned to Kate. She looked at the bound wrists. She looked at Kate's face. She looked at Ranger standing steady at Kate's left, and something moved across her expression. Not guilt exactly, not regret exactly, but the complex expression of a person who has made a decision she believed was necessary and is now standing for the first time inside its consequences. Someone get those restraints off, Doyle said. Finch moved first. He pulled a knife from his kit and cut the paracord in 2 quick movements. Kate brought her hands around in front of her and let the circulation return without comment. Doyle held Kate's gaze for another moment. The look of someone who has something they need to say and is calculating whether this is the right time, deciding it is not. She turned and walked back toward the administrative building. Brad Calloway and the others followed. Kate stood in the yard with Ranger beside her and watched them go. Then she looked down at him. He looked up at her. The exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds and contained no commands and required none, because what was being communicated between them in those 2 seconds did not belong to the vocabulary of commands. She would need to get him to the veterinary station. She would need to document the shoulder injury and the nutritional deficiency and every observable evidence of what had been done to him. She would need to do this in the proper order through the proper channels. She would need to do all of these things. But first she put her hand on Ranger's head, flat palmed the way he had always preferred. He leaned into it. She said quietly to no one but him, "Let's get you looked at." And he walked beside her out of the compound and into whatever came next, steady at her left exactly where he had always been. The veterinary station at Fort Benning was empty at that hour, except for a staff sergeant named Holloway who had been on overnight duty for 11 months and had learned in that time the skill of asking only the questions that needed to be asked. He looked at Ranger when Kate brought him through the door. He looked at the ribs at the shoulder, at the dull coat, and the compensated gait. He absorbed all of this with the expression of a professional, taking in information that is difficult to take in, and then he looked at Kate and he asked exactly one question. "How long?" 13 months, Kate said. "At minimum." He nodded and moved to the supply cabinet. "I need to document everything before we treat, for the record." "Do it thoroughly," Kate said. He did. She stayed with Ranger through the examination, one hand on his flank, steady and continuous, because the examination required things that Ranger had been conditioned to resist contact from strangers, handling of the shoulder close approach from multiple angles, and her presence was the variable that made those things possible. She spoke to him throughout low, and even the private language that still worked, that 11 months of neglect had not erased. Holloway documented 14 distinct findings: the shoulder wound, the nutritional indicators, 3 older marks that he described in the careful language of official documentation as consistent with blunt force trauma sustained at different times over an extended period. When he was done, he looked at his own notes for a moment. Then he said still to the notes rather than to Kate, "This is going to be a long report." "Good," she said. She left Ranger in Holloway's care at 2 in the morning with instructions and with the faith of someone handing a trust to a person who has demonstrated they deserve it. Ranger watched her go from the examination table. He did not make a sound. He simply watched with the attention of an animal that has learned or relearned that watching someone leave does not mean they are not coming back. She told herself she would be back before morning. She meant it. The administrative building was lit from inside with the quality of a place where something official is happening. Not warm residential light, but the flat fluorescent light of institutional process of forms being filled out and statements being taken, and the slow machinery of accountability beginning to turn. Kate walked toward it. She was 20 yards from the entrance when she heard footsteps behind her moving at a pace designed to intercept rather than follow. She did not increase her speed. She turned and waited. Master Sergeant Phil Crane was 54 years old, built in the way that military service builds people when they stay in long enough. Not for appearance but for function, with the economy of movement that comes from decades of work. He had a face that had made peace with itself a long time ago, and gray at his temples and the bearing of a man who believes genuinely and without performance that he is doing the right thing. That was the most important thing about Phil Crane according to the file. He was not corrupt in the ordinary sense. He was not protecting Brad Calloway for money or for advancement or for any of the transactional reasons that corruption usually serves. He was protecting Brad Calloway because he believed Brad Calloway deserved to be protected, and he believed this with the conviction that makes a man dangerous in a specific way, because conviction is harder to argue with than self-interest, and because a man acting from genuine belief does not have the vulnerability of a man acting from greed. Crane stopped in front of her. He said, "I need you to hear something before you go in there." She said, "I'm listening." He looked at her with the look of a man deciding how much of something to give. Then he said, "Kandahar, November 2019. There was a forward operating base called Wolverine. 42 personnel. There was an incident. I won't use the operational language because the operational language is designed to make things sound smaller than they are. 3 vehicles. A route that had been cleared on paper but not in fact. And the kind of situation where the difference between the people who came back and the people who didn't came down specifically to one person making a decision in about 4 seconds that most people would not have had the capacity to make." He stopped. He let that sit. "Brad Calloway made that decision," Crane said. "The 3 men who came home from that route, they have families because of a call that Brad made in 4 seconds under conditions that I have not personally experienced, and I have been in this uniform for 31 years. He paused. The after-action report was classified almost immediately, not for operational security, because the road had been cleared by someone at a level above Brad's pay grade, and that person's error was the reason the situation happened, and that error was not something the people responsible wanted in an unclassified document." Kate said nothing. "Brad was put in for commendation," Crane continued. "The commendation was processed and then quietly reduced to a unit citation that didn't attach to his individual record in any meaningful way. He was told this was administrative, that it would be corrected in time. He was passed over for promotion 8 months later, and then again 14 months after that. His evaluations were solid. His conduct record was clean. There was no documented reason." Crane's voice remained even throughout. "The evenness of a man who has been angry about something for a long time and has converted the anger into something colder and more durable. I am not telling you what happened in that compound tonight was acceptable," he said. "I am telling you that the man who did it is not the man he started as. And I am telling you that the system that made him what he is does not get to stand outside what happened here and act like it has clean hands." The night air between them was still. Kate looked at Crane for a long moment. She thought about what he had said. She thought about the crumpled rejection notice on Brad's desk beside the framed commendation. She thought about Daniel Ash and the 7 months he spent fighting a process that had decided the wrong thing about him, and about the letter of apology that was carefully worded to avoid saying sorry. She said, "I believe everything you just told me, Sergeant." Crane said, "Then," she said, "I also believe that none of it changes what happened in that compound. Not for the people it happened to before me. Not for the next person it would have happened to if tonight had gone the way it was supposed to go." She let that land. "The system failed Brad Calloway. That's true, and it will be part of the record, and the people responsible for that failure will be part of this investigation because they are part of this story. But Brad Calloway did not respond to the system's failure by fighting it. He built a smaller version of the same thing inside his own unit. He found people with less power than him, and he decided that his pain gave him the right to cause them pain. And a man who was twice a victim chose to make other people victims, and that choice belongs to him." Crane was quiet. "What happens to him?" he said. "That's not my decision," Kate said. She paused. "But if you're asking what the record will show everything. His service in Kandahar. The commendation that was mishandled. The promotion process without a documented reason. And what happened in that compound. All of it in the same file because all of it is true." She looked at him without unkindness. "I'm not here to destroy anyone, Sergeant. I'm here because 3 people reported what was happening, and those reports did not go anywhere, and the next person who would have reported it might not have survived to do so." She said this last part without drama because it was a fact, and facts don't require dramatizing. "That's why I'm here. Not to decide who deserves what. To make sure the record is complete." Crane stood with this for a moment. He said very quietly, "How long have you been here?" She said, 6 weeks. He processed this. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has understood something he did not want to understand and is deciding to accept it because it is true. And he is, despite everything, fundamentally a man who accepts true things. He said, "What do you need from me?" Kate said, "Your full cooperation with the inquiry, your honest account of what you knew and when. And if there are others in the command structure who had information about what was happening here and made decisions about it, I need those names." Crane was quiet for a moment. He gave her 2 names. She wrote them in the small notebook she carried, the same one she had been carrying since she drove south from Washington, which was now 3/4 full. He turned and walked away without another word, and she watched him go, and she thought about what he had said about 4 seconds and 3 men going home to their families, and about the fact that this was the same man who had spent 13 months ensuring that the dog those men hadn't known about was not on anyone's official radar. People were not simple. She had always known this intellectually. She was perpetually surprised in practice by how comprehensively true it was. She turned and walked into the administrative building. Colonel Doyle was in the large conference room at the end of the main corridor, seated at the head of the table with a legal pad and a pen, and the expression of a person who has been doing a specific kind of thinking for the past hour and has arrived somewhere she needed to arrive. Brad Calloway was at the far end of the room, seated with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has been told formally to wait. Krause and Finch were in the anteroom separately with the slightly dazed quality of people who have recently had the ground shift under them and are still adjusting to the new grade. Marcus Webb was in a chair near the window with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for a long time and has developed a high tolerance for it. Doyle looked up when Kate entered. She said, "Close the door." Kate closed it. For a moment, the room held the kind of silence that accumulates when people have things to say to each other, complicated enough to require some preliminary quiet. Doyle said, "I was in the yard tonight before they opened the gate." Kate said, "I know." Doyle looked at her. "You knew before you came out of the compound." "I knew before I went in," Kate said. "I knew you had information about what Calloway was doing and that you were in a position where the information wasn't sufficient to act on through normal channels. I knew that the pattern of the previous complaints, the way they were processed and went quiet, meant someone at the command level was either complicit or was navigating a situation where acting would expose something they weren't prepared to expose. You were the third option. Someone who knew who was waiting for evidence she could act on, who was making a calculation about acceptable risks that she hadn't made on her own behalf." Doyle was quiet. Kate said, "You let me go into that compound because I knew what was in there. You knew I had a history with that dog. You knew I had a better chance of surviving than anyone else you could have sent, and you knew that if I survived, you would have the direct evidence you needed." She paused. "What you didn't know is whether I had consented to that calculation." Doyle said, "Had you?" Kate said, "I'm still working that out." The honesty of this sat in the room between them. Doyle said, "What I did tonight will be part of the record. My decision to observe without intervening. The reasoning behind it. All of it." She said this without the performance of confession, with the directness of a woman who has made a decision and intends to own it in full, including the parts that don't look good. "I'm not going to tell you it was the right thing. I made a calculation. The calculation involved risk to you. You deserve to be informed of that risk, and I decided that informing you would compromise the outcome." Kate said, "And if Ranger had been different, if he hadn't known me, if the situation in that compound had gone the way Calloway expected it to go?" Doyle held her gaze. She said, "Then I would have intervened." She said it without the quickness of someone defending themselves, with the weight of someone who has already spent an hour sitting alone with that sentence and is certain of it, and also certain that certainty does not resolve the moral problem it contains. Kate said, "I believe you." She said it because she did believe it, and because the thing about being precise, the thing she had learned in the long, difficult months after Tacoma was for him, that precision required calling things what they were in both directions. Doyle had put Kate at risk without her knowledge. Doyle had also been the only person at this base with sufficient authority to stop what was happening here, who had been trying to stop it within the constraints of what the evidence would support. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That was the part about justice that nobody who hadn't done this work seemed to fully understand. It was almost never clean. It was almost never the simple confrontation of right with wrong that the word implied. It was almost always the confrontation of one complicated true thing with another complicated true thing, and the work was not to find the version where everything was simple, but to make sure the record captured the complexity accurately. Kate placed her identification on the table. Not her processing papers, not the Fort Benning arrival documentation. The other card. The laminated identification with the seal of the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, her name, her grade, her authorization. Doyle looked at it for a moment. She had, Kate thought, already suspected. The way Doyle had looked at her in the yard earlier, not with the expression of a superior evaluating a subordinate, but with the specific look of a person whose working theory about a situation is being confirmed. Doyle said, "How long has the IG had this installation on the active inquiry list?" Kate said, "Since Private Webb's third submission, 3 months ago." She looked at Marcus as she said this. He was watching from his chair by the window with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this moment for a long time and is finding that the moment itself is quieter than he expected it to be. There was no triumph in his face. There was the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has just been allowed to set it down. Kate said to him, "The first complaint you filed went to the company level. It was processed and then it wasn't. The second went to the battalion review office. Same result. The third you sent directly to the IG's office in Washington through the emergency submission channel." Marcus said, "I didn't know if it would work." Kate said, "It worked." He looked at her. She said, "You sent 3 complaints over 3 months through every available channel, and when the channels didn't work, you found a new one. When I received your file in Washington, it was the most thorough piece of documentation I had seen from a junior enlisted service member in 6 years of doing this work." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "You started this. I just showed up." The room was quiet. Brad Calloway, at the far end of the table, had not spoken since Kate entered. He had been watching with the expression of a man watching something entirely outside his ability to affect. The performance of authority had been set down somewhere between the compound and this room, and what was left was a younger man than the one who had walked across the yard tonight. Not younger in age, younger in the sense of having the protective surface removed. The hardness that builds over years when a person has decided the world owes them something and they intend to collect. He said, "I saved 3 men." He said it to the table. He said it with the flatness of someone making a statement of fact they believe is being insufficiently considered. Kate said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "It's in the record. Everything you did in Kandahar is going into the record. The commendation process, the classification decision, the promotion reviews, all of it in the same file as tonight because it's all true and because the only honest account of who you are is the account that contains all of it." Brad said, "They took something from me." Kate said, "Yes." He looked at her and she saw in his face the thing that made this hard, not the manipulation, not the performance, but the real thing underneath it. The genuine and justified grievance of a man who had been failed by the institution he had served and had responded to that failure in a way that caused serious harm to people who had nothing to do with it. The grievance was real. The response to it had been wrong. Both of those things were true, and neither canceled the other. She said, "I know they did. That's going to matter. It's not going to be determinative, but it's going to matter because the full story is the only story I'm authorized to tell." He nodded once. He didn't say anything else. The hours that followed had the quality that formal process always has: methodical, repetitive, designed not for drama, but for accuracy. Statements were taken, documents were reviewed. The footage from Marcus Webb's phone was examined, logged, and transferred through the appropriate chain. Holloway's veterinary report arrived electronically at 3:45 in the morning. 14 findings carefully worded and absolutely clear. Doyle authorized the formal hold on Calloway, Krause, and Finch pending court-martial referral. 3 specific charges: conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, willful destruction of military property. Ranger's condition had been formally assessed as the result of deliberate neglect of a military working animal and aggravated assault supported by the 2 previous incidents that Webb's documentation had identified by date and by the names of the people involved. Those 2 individuals were contacted. One was still in service at a different installation and agreed to provide a formal statement. The other had left the military 8 months earlier. He agreed as well. Both statements were submitted within 48 hours with a specificity that told Kate they had been waiting for the opportunity to submit them. Phil Crane submitted a voluntary written account that ran to 11 pages and named names at 2 levels of the command structure above Fort Benning. He submitted it without being formally compelled to. Kate thought he had probably been composing it in his head for longer than he would admit. It was the act she understood of a man who had finally found a distinction he could live with between loyalty to a person and loyalty to the truth and had chosen accordingly. Doyle submitted herself to the inquiry voluntarily with the composed precision of a person who has already decided exactly what she is going to say and how she is going to say it. She named her decision. She named her reasoning. She named the point at which she understood she had used another person as an instrument without that person's knowledge. She said all of this without qualification and without the careful hedging language that institutional self-preservation usually produces. The inquiry into her conduct would take 3 months. The outcome would be what the evidence warranted. At 5 in the morning, Kate went back to the veterinary station. Holloway had gone off duty and left Ranger in the overnight care space, a room with a padded floor and a water bowl and a regulated temperature. Ranger was lying on his side, not asleep, ears moving, when she opened the door. She sat on the floor beside him, not in the compound dirt, not under the floodlights, not in the presence of anyone else. On a clean floor in a warm room in the hour before the Georgia dawn, when the base was as quiet as it ever got. Ranger put his head in her lap. She sat with her back against the wall and her hand resting on him, and she did not say anything for a long time because there was nothing that needed saying. The things that mattered between them had already been said in a compound 40 minutes ago, in the 11 seconds when she put her forehead against his, and the growl stopped. In the 6 months at Lackland, when she had shown up every morning and been consistent and meant it, which Beaumont had told her was the entire content of trust. She thought about what it meant to come back. She thought about this for a long time in the quiet of the room while Ranger breathed slowly and the darkness outside began incrementally to change. Coming back was not dramatic usually. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive with the clarity of a decision made in a significant moment. It was more often the result of smaller decisions made in sequence to submit a report, instead of letting it go, to drive to Georgia instead of staying in Washington, to take one step forward in a compound after 11 months of someone else's damage, and speak a name in a language built from patience. She had come back to the work after Tacoma, and the work had brought her here. She had come back to Ranger, and he had come back to her, as though the 13 months were a parenthesis, not erased, not unfelt, but not determinative. She did not know yet whether she had made any mistakes in what happened tonight. She would not know for weeks, perhaps months, as the formal process moved through its stages and the record filled in. The thing she had learned from the error in Tacoma was that certainty in the moment was not the same as being right, and that the difference only emerged later in the light of consequence. She thought she had done the right things. She thought the methodology had been sound. But she also thought that the fear in her hands as she walked out of that compound was information worth keeping. The trembling she had not shown anyone was the instrument telling her something true about the gap between confidence and certainty, and the gap was worth respecting. Ranger shifted. He sighed, the deep, specific sigh of an animal that has been on guard for a long time and has in this moment set the guard down. She looked at him in the early gray light. She would hand him over to a new handler. She had already identified the person, Corporal Adeline Walsh, 27, certified at the highest level, with a record she had reviewed 3 times because it was genuinely exceptional. Walsh would be given the full history, the specific language, the 47 commands, and the hand signals, and the particular cadence that Ranger responded to. She would be given everything. It would not be the same. Not be a dim. Kate understood this without grief, or with grief held at the distance that professionalism requires, which is a form of grief that is not a failure of detachment, but rather a form of honesty about what things cost. 6 weeks later, Kate sat in a conference room in Washington with Gerald Park. He read her report in full. He read the supplementary documents. He reviewed the Holloway veterinary findings in the web submissions, in the Crane voluntary statement, in the Doyle inquiry's transcript, which was still ongoing, but had reached the point where its direction was clear. He set the folder down. He said, "The Callaway situation." She said, "Is complex?" He said, "The Kandahar record." She said, "Is part of the file." He looked at her. "You put it in yourself. You didn't have to." She said, "I had to." He studied her for a moment with the expression she recognized after 6 years as the expression he used when she had said something he agreed with. He said, "You're going back to active rotation." She said, "Yes." He said, "There'll be another assignment, probably within the month." She said, "I know." She drove back to her apartment that evening through Washington traffic, and she did not think about the report or the assignment or the court-martial proceedings now formally underway. She thought about Lackland, about a summer 2 years ago when she had sat on the ground at the far edge of a pen every morning for 3 days without speaking, learning in practice. What she had only understood theoretically, that consistency was the thing, that showing up every day and meaning it was the entire content of trust. That trust, once genuinely built, was more durable than the forces assembled against it. She thought about Corporal Adeline Walsh, who had driven down from her posting and arrived at Fort Benning on a Thursday morning with the right certifications and from the first hour the right patience. Kate had introduced them in the careful, graduated way that the transition required. Walsh had understood immediately what was being asked of her. She had sat on the floor and waited, and after 20 minutes, Ranger had walked over. Kate had stood at the edge of the room and watched. She had stayed 2 days until she was certain, until she saw in the quality of Ranger's attention toward Walsh the beginning of the thing that would, over weeks and months of daily work, become what it needed to become. Then she had said goodbye to Ranger in the way you say goodbye to an animal, without the word, without the ceremony, with only the flat hand on the head and the sustained moment of contact that says in a language that doesn't need translation, this mattered, and mattering does not end when people part. He had watched her go. She drove through the Washington evening and thought about what Crane had said in the yard about 4 seconds and 3 men going home to their families. She thought about Marcus Webb, who had filed 3 reports into what seemed like a wall and had filed a 4th and had been right that something was on the other side. She thought about Colonel Doyle, who was still sitting with her decision inside the consequence of it doing what Gerald Park had once told Kate was the correct response to a mistake, staying and being better and finding out over time which of those 2 things was harder. And she thought about Brad Calloway, whose grievance had been real and whose response to it had caused real harm, and about the fact that both of those things were in the same file because both of them were true, and because the only honest account of a person is the account that contains all of them. She parked outside her building. She sat in the car for a moment in the Washington dark. She thought about what Beaumont had told her the first day in San Antonio when she asked him what the single most important thing was. He had not said patience. He had not said skill. He had said you have to mean it, because animals cannot be lied to about intent, because they read what's underneath the words, not the words themselves. Because the thing being communicated in every moment of that work was not information but character, not what you knew, but what you actually were measured in the daily unglamorous, uncelebrated work of showing up and meaning it. She didn't know if that made her better at the other work. She suspected it made her more honest about what the other work required. And she was not sure that honesty and better were always the same thing, but she had decided in the long, difficult time after Tacoma to act as though they were, because the alternative was to stop believing that the gap between them could be closed, and once you stop believing that the work is not worth doing. She got out of the car. She went inside. The next assignment, when it came, would come the way they always came, a folder, a name, a place that had a problem, someone had reported, and nobody had listened to. She would read it carefully with the part of her mind that looks for pattern, and with the part of her that remembers Tacoma, and with the part of her that had sat on the floor of a veterinary station in Georgia in the gray early morning with a dog she had trained and lost and found again. She would read it and she would decide, and somewhere in the decision would be the question she had stopped trying to resolve and had instead learned to carry, because carrying it was the thing that kept her accurate. Not whether she was right, whether she was willing to come back. Brad Calloway had believed the system owed him something. He wasn't entirely wrong. Phil Crane had tried to protect the wrong person for reasons he believed were right. He wasn't entirely wrong either. Nancy Doyle had watched from the shadows and waited for the evidence and lived inside the cost of that waiting. She was still living in Igden. Kate Mercer had come back to a job she had failed at once, in a place she hadn't planned to return to for a dog she had not forgotten. The system hadn't fixed itself. One report had done it, filed quietly through a channel most people didn't know existed by a private nobody had thought to listen to. 3 times into silence. And then a 4th time because Marcus Webb had decided that the 4th time was the only response available to a person who believes the truth should go somewhere. She stood at her window for a moment before she turned off the light. She thought about Ranger, about the 4th morning at Lackland when he had walked to within 6 feet of her and stopped, which was the moment she had understood that patience practiced long enough becomes its own argument. About the way he had pressed his forehead against her chest in a Georgia compound, and the growl had stopped, and the 11 months had been not erased but answered. Some things once genuinely built are more durable than the forces arrayed against them. She had believed that before. She believed it still. She turned off the light. Outside Washington went about its business in the ordinary dark, and somewhere in Georgia, in a warm room with a padded floor, a dog that had not let anyone touch him for 11 months was sleeping without his guard up. Which is a small thing, and also not a small thing at all, depending on what you understand about what it takes to earn that kind of quiet and what it means when it finally comes.